So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, again, for whom we've been waiting for 2 years with anticipation. I personally love coyotes. Anyone else love coyotes? Right? So I am excited to hear what he has to say to us this evening about coyotes. Dan Flores is an environmental writer, former professor of history of the American West at the University of Montana, a native of Louisiana, and currently a resident of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He has written for the New York Times. You guys have heard of that, right? The Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and numerous magazines. He's the author of 11 books, including Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History, a New York Times bestseller, and lots of awards here. And you can probably read that on the book jacket. Pretty amazing. His next book that's coming out is Wild New World, the epic story of animals and people in America. It's scheduled to come out in October of this year, 2022. So be on the lookout. Maybe there's some early ordering that can be done around that. He received his MA in history from Northwestern State University and his PhD from Texas A&M University. And he began his academic career at Texas Tech University, where he taught from 1978 to 1992, spent a year at the University of Wyoming in 1986. Anybody there in 1986 rubbing elbows with Dan? And then relocated to the University of Montana, where he held the A.B. Hammond Chair in Western History from 1992 until he decided to retire to Santa Fe in May of 2014. We're so happy to have you with us here this evening, Dan. Welcome to the stage. I'm leaving them all here. Just in
Okay.
case.
All right, just in case. Hello, all of you, and thank you for coming out. I much appreciate it. Been plotting this occasion for 2 years. Tamara and I have talked about it in various guises, thought for a while about doing it via Zoom. And I started asking her a few months ago if maybe things would be okay by this time of the spring of 2022 to actually do this in person, because I wanted to come out, and I will frankly tell you why. I'm a writer. As writers tend to do, I spend a lot of time alone, a lot of time staring at a computer screen. And frankly, it's fun to be around people again. So I'm kind of delighted to be able to do something like this with real faces, beating hearts in the crowd, and being able to see people's expressions as I talk. As you can see from the image on the screen, I argue in my book, Coyote America, that the coyote is really our national mammal. We just don't know it yet. I think the coyote knows it, but we haven't quite understood that this is the animal that really represents America. And not just to those of us who live in the West and have been familiar with coyotes for a long time. One of the reasons I wrote Coyote America is I knew that coyotes were spreading across the country. They were in towns and cities in the Midwest, in the East and the South, in places where it was evident people were seeing them for the first time, had no idea what to think about them. And one of the things I wanted to do with that book was to provide people with a way to understand this animal, because if you don't go to some effort to understand it and you simply go on kind of gut reaction, you're likely to form the wrong opinion about these creatures that have, after all, been in North America for more than 5 million years. One of the things I argue in Coyote America is that this animal has been singing the original national anthem of America for far longer than the United States has ever existed. And so this book is a biography, as that text says, of our national, our sort of under the radar national mammal. But it's also a kind of a plea for people to please take the time to learn about this creature, because we're all treated these days to a world of coyotes trotting down the streets of our suburbs, trotting through our backyards. You don't have to go to Alaska or Yellowstone National Park to see an American wolf. You get to look out your kitchen window and see one, because of course that's what coyotes really are. They're a small jackal-like American wolf. So the talk I want to do for you tonight, as you saw in the literature promoting this lecture, has to do with coyotes and the West Coast. At least some of it does. And so I want to spend a little time tonight talking about how California and the West Coast of North America has sort of played a role, as California often does, in pointing America in the direction of how to understand this animal. But I want to start it in a slightly different place and a slightly different time than today, and you'll see what I mean. In 1900, 122 years ago, an ambitious nature writer named Ernest Thompson Seton wrote one of the most intriguing stories ever penned about coyotes. That's no faint praise, since his subject has inspired thousands of stories over the years. Tito is what he called his story, the account of the coyote that learned how. It was the lead piece in the August 1900 Scribners. And like many of the Indian coyote stories that folklorists were just then beginning to collect, and realizing, by the way, in the process, that North America had a literary tradition that stretched back thousands of years in the form of these oral coyote stories. Ernest Thompson Seton's Tito story took an observable truth and tried to explain it. That truth was a widespread puzzlement about coyotes 122 years ago. Why weren't they doing the proper thing and dying off? Americans at the turn of the 20th century were neck deep in the largest destruction of wildlife discoverable anywhere in modern world history. 30 million bison were all but gone, drawn down to 1,000 animals. So were 15 million pronghorns, down to 7,000 animals by the beginning of the 20th century. We had so devastated elk, bighorn sheep, and grizzly bears that they were surviving only as tiny remnants that had fled into the mountains. 3 million wild horses were about to end up in pet food cans. And by 1920, we had poisoned to death 500,000 gray wolves and an untold number of red wolves in the South. That's one of the most disturbing photographs of a wolf destruction in America that I've ever come across, from the 1880s in Wyoming. when Seton wrote Tito, the most numerous bird on earth, the American passenger pigeon, had about a decade of existence left in the world. And I could go on and on with this. And in the new book that I have coming out in the fall, Wild New World, I do go on because there are many, many other stories like this to tell. But as the Scribner's article put it, despite the fierce war that for a long time been waged against the coyote kind, this is Ernest Thompson Seton's sentence, for some inexplicable reason, coyotes weren't following suit. Indeed, the more we shot them, poisoned them, trapped them, ran them with dogs, blew up their dens, the more of them there seemed to be. And that was a mystery to Americans 120 years ago. To offer an explanation, Seton invented Tito, a little female coyote captured as a pup and chained in a ranch yard as a curiosity, where she shrewdly observed how her human captors used guns, traps, dogs, and poisons against her kin. Ultimately, Tito escapes, finds a mate, has pups of her own, and then she proceeds in Ernest Thompson Seton's story to teach her pups and their children's children, as he writes it, all the tricks of coyote extermination. In other words, Tito is sending down through the generations of coyotes learned coyote culture. Seton's human analog for this, Moses, of course, who by growing up among the Egyptians was able to learn their plans, which enabled him to save the Israelites from destruction. So Tito, he says at the end of his story, is the American version of Moses. Seton's Tito was a charming allegorical story, and if you weren't a sheepman or a government predator hunter, it was fun to imagine it might be true. But in 1900, coyotes really were becoming more numerous in America, even as all those other animals were disappearing. They were also spreading out of the West, and over the next century would even start showing up in cities, first in arid southwestern ones like Los Angeles, and eventually in urban jungles as far-flung as Denver, Chicago, New York, and now in North Coast towns like Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. It turned out the coyote puzzle Seton tried to resolve with Tito was going to require figuring out a hell of a lot more of the Coyote biography than any of us had ever known before. And I will say, what a biography coyotes turned out to have. When we humans got to North America, we now think 23,000 years ago, coyotes greeted us at the door. The Canidae family, which produced not just wolves, jackals, and coyotes, but eventually, of course, your pup at home, is a 5.3 million year old family of indigenous American animals. Jackals, gray wolves, and others did eventually migrate across the land bridges into the old world, into Asia and Europe. Gray wolf ancestors in particular colonizing most of the planet before they started returning to North America about 30,000 years ago. So although gray wolves actually originated here in North America, their ancestors left, crossed the Bering Land bridges going the other way, ended up in Asia and in Europe. And then about 30,000 years ago, and what we think are probably the 4 waves that correspond to the species and subspecies of gray wolves that exist in America today, they began returning to North America. Coyotes, however, never left. And by 800,000 years ago, they were evolving into their modern form as a medium-sized jackal-like wolf very similar to the animal you see on the screen, which is actually not a coyote, but a golden jackal. Golden jackals are found in North Africa, Southern Europe, and have now begun, just as coyotes have done in North America, to expand across Europe. I have a correspondent in the Netherlands who says they have been spotted in Amsterdam. But this is not a coyote. This is a golden jackal, closely related to coyotes 800,000 years ago, split from them, we think, about that time, about the time the modern coyote began to emerge here in North America. But nonetheless, this animal has a 3% genetic difference between itself and coyotes. Coyotes never left America, as I said. And if you want to understand what it's really like to be a true native of North America, a true American, I would propose that we should study the canid that never left here, because it really has been yipping and howling that original national anthem all this time while we were struggling to find the place. When humans wandered out of Africa and across Asia and finally made it to North America, they confronted a massive die-off, oddly similar to the one that Seton invoked in Scribner's in his Tito essay. Mammoths, camels, horses, lions were all disappearing in North America. But a particular survivor of that crash, which many people refer to as the Pleistocene extinctions, caught the attention of the first human Americans. And soon enough, because the animal that was surviving this crash, just as had happened 120 years ago, began to attract the attention of people, these early Americans began thinking of the coyote as an avatar, a stand-in for humans in the imagination. So in the stories they began telling about coyotes, Coyote with a capital C emerged as one of America's oldest gods, a deity responsible for creating the terrain and the rivers of Western North America, and also as the main character in North America's oldest literature. For some people, like the Karuks, he invented fire. In stories from the Yanas and others, he famously introduced death into the world. One of the coyote stories I tell, in fact, in Coyote America, is a story of how Coyote and why Coyote introduced death, and how his introduction of death, it's a Nez Perce story, by the way, came back to haunt him. I will just say about those native stories, so many of them ended up being collected by ethnographers in the early parts of the 20th century that they threatened to crash the whole ethnography game. There are thousands of them out there from virtually every group of people that was found from Mexico City northward into Western Canada and west of the Mississippi River in what is now the United States. Everybody had legions of coyote stories, and confronted with that enormous body of literature, I ended up picking 4 that I told in a chapter in the book called Old Man America. And those 4 stories I thought were somewhat typical of the range of the stories. And one of them, as I mentioned, is this Nez Perce story about how Coyote and why Coyote made it essential that we all die. It was the Aztecs whose name for him became widespread. This is one of the animals that disappeared. I should have gone to this slide a little bit earlier. This is a scene probably classic in America from the time coyotes and wolves were sharing the Pleistocene world. And what you see on the left side of that screen, by the way, is obviously a gray wolf. And there's a grizzly bear on the right side of the screen. Flanking the grizzly bear on either side are coyotes. So that'll give you a little bit of a sense of the jackal-like size of coyotes compared to gray wolves. But this is a scene that you would have found in North America as soon as gray wolves began returning here, starting 30,000 years ago. And this scene is from Yellowstone today. So you still get to see this kind of thing in America. So here, by the way, this is the only rock art scene that I've ever located. This one is in West Texas, of a coyote story representing Coyote, the mythical deity figure of the native people. That's Coyote on the far left of the screen. His tail is almost gone. It's nearly disappeared because of erosion of the rock, but you can still see his head, and you can see little ears on top of the head. Just in front of him is beaver, and the other animals that appear in front of those two are various other figures in whatever particular story this is. But this is a pictograph in Paladero Canyon in West Texas of one of these famous literary stories about Coyote and his role in the world. So what I was about to tell you is this, is the Aztecs, whose name for him became widespread in Western America. And among the Aztecs, he inspired 4 different gods. This is one of them. And this particular one is the Aztec god of poetry and, naturally enough, song. Coyote, in other words, is Old Man America. He's a god out of America's Paleolithic past and has been in place as a deity in North America for probably at least 10,000 years. Some of these stories seem to go back that far. Coyote, with a capital C, was an avatar of survival in the human imagination. He stood upright on 2 legs, as you saw in that previous slide. He had arms and hands, although he brandished a tail and a wolfish head. And he was also, and this is the most important part about Coyote, he was the personification of the full suite of humanity's traits. On the one hand, Coyote as a deity was admirable, inspirational, imaginative, energetic, a whirlwind biophysical force with a large capacity for taking sensuous pleasure in life. But Coyote was also selfish, vain, narcissistic, lustful, envious, deceitful. In other words, he was not a god of perfection, he was a god of humanity. Coyote was possessed of an overconfidence that endlessly got him into fixes in these stories. And those stories have survived for thousands of years because, frankly, they were potent and often comic shout outs to human nature. That's really what these Coyote stories are about. We've long referred to Coyote as a trickster. And for a century, to me, after reading hundreds of them, I concluded we had sort of been missing the point. The point is not that Coyote is a trickster, because in Coyote literature, it's not the trick that's the thing. It's why the trick works that's the thing. And the reason the trick works is because of who we are. Who we are, of course, is invariably a consequence of our classic flaws, which these Coyote stories point out again and again. I mean, some of them are absolutely hilarious. The first one I tell in the book is from the Wichita people of southwestern Oklahoma. It's called Coyote and His Knee. And if you don't have a chance to read anything else in that book, just sit down at some point and read that story. Now, what I do with those stories is I tell them in my own prose. I convert them into modern prose, in other words, but the story is absolutely true to the actual account by the Wichitas. And you will understand when you read that story what I've been telling you here over the last few minutes. California has played a critical role in preserving Coyote's place as an American avatar. But in this roller coaster biography of Coyotes in North America, there were some other stages first. Europeans, for example, arrived in America with experiences with bears, with foxes, with wolves, but with no prior knowledge about coyotes at all. When Lewis and Clark encountered them in the West, they gave them the name prairie wolves. And for a lot of the 19th century, even up to about 1915 or 1920, you will still see references to prairie wolves, meaning coyotes, in American literature, magazine articles, and books. By 1872, when Mark Twain published his funny but knife-edged Coyote send-up, he called coyotes a living, breathing allegory of want. In Roughing It is the book I'm referring to. Here's, by the way, one of the, as far as I'm aware, the earliest portrait of a coyote that we have from American history, done by a German artist on the Missouri River in the early 1830s. But Mark Twain's Roughing It book, well, I'll put it up for you and you can read some of it. By this time, as you can see up at the top of the third line of this passage, Americans were picking up the old Aztec name for the animal, which in the Nahuatl language was pronounced coyote, but it had been Hispanicized by the settlers of the Southwest into 3 syllables, coyote. And so Mark Twain is giving us a version for Americans of how you pronounce this, coyote, he says. But then if you read how this goes along, I mean, look at this. This is at a time when Americans really didn't exactly know what to think about coyotes. We didn't understand them. We didn't really know precisely the role they played in the world. And Mark Twain gave us a way to think about them. He's always poor, out of luck, friendless. The meanest creatures despise him. Sure. And even the fleas would desert him for a velocipede. So he goes on. And by the way, this goes on for 3 pages. I mean, you know, he's Mark Twain. He gets warmed up. And when he gets warmed up, it really starts getting fun. But what basically tends to happen in this description is that it gives Americans a whole new way to think about this animal, and it's not a flattering way to think about them in the least. As for stockmen in the West, this is one of my local coyotes behind my house, by the way, in New Mexico. I tell the story actually in the book of why this coyote is sitting there watching me and my dog. And I tell that story as a kind of an instruction for people of how to get along with coyotes, because my dog and I happened to wander up on a den during the season when coyotes have pups. And the yearlings from the year before were the sentinels, the sentries of that den. And this little female not only sat 20 feet away and watched us, she escorted us back home. The stockmen in the American West didn't really want to know much about coyotes, except that they seem to be some kind of wolf. And so they pressured the federal government, the stock owners associations began pressuring the federal government in the late 19th century to start coming up with a solution to what they call the wolf and coyote problem. Now, I'm not going to go, although I do in the book, into the long history of bounties for these animals. I will just tell you, this is not something I say in Coyote America, but I talk about it in the book that's coming out this fall. the very first environmental law that Europeans passed in North America was a bounty on wolves. That was our first environmental law passed in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1632. So with a herding culture now come to America, native people, of course, weren't herders, and so they didn't regard coyotes or wolves as a threat. They, in fact, regarded them as avatars and an inspiration. But bringing a herding culture out of the old world to the Americas, the stockmen's associations attempted to get rid of predatory animals from the very beginning of their arrival in North America. And by the early 1900s, they had pressured the federal government to come up with a solution. And that solution was in the form of a federal agency called the Biological Survey. The Biological Survey had started out with a very different mission. It was supposed to go around, send naturalists around North America and try to find out what animals were left after our massive destruction of them, how many, and so forth. But year after year, they struggled to get funding in Congress. And so they ended up finally, by 1905, the Biological Survey said, well, if what you need is some practical function rather than just learning about wild animals in North America, how about we become the solution to the predatory problem? So the Biological Survey, that's the beginnings, by the way, ultimately of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, at the bequest of herders of cattle and sheep, launched America into what is frankly, and I won't brook any words here, is the most vicious attempt at outright extermination of animals we have ever brought against any species in United States history. Starting first with strychnine, then newer poisons like thallium sulfate, sodium fluoroacetate. Sodium fluoroacetate is the one we know as 1080, because the lab that was working on this, the Extermination Methods Lab, it was called, took 1,080 tries to perfect this particular poison. And finally, sodium cyanide, with all those poisons broadcast across Western America, sometimes putting out as many as 3.5 million baits a year. That agency killed 8.5 million coyotes in the United States between 1915 and 1972. I'll just give you a small sample. This is obviously not easy to look at. I will call your attention. I had looked at this because I averted my gaze from it within a few seconds every time I looked at this picture. And finally, one day I happened to notice that the hunters for the Biological Survey had actually arrayed a coyote behind the wheel of the car who is driving the vehicle. That evidently was really funny. And then they put together these canned newspaper stories that were printed all over America during the 1920s and 1930s, where these predator hunters from the federal government are treated as the G-men who are going after the desperados of the animal world, just like the G-men from the FBI are going after John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and the gangsters of the 20s and early 30s. These stories were published in newspapers all over the United States. The Washington Post published this. This one, of course, appeared in the Denver Rocky Mountain News. Finally, scientists and naturalists actually began studying coyotes, because all of this had happened without anyone actually bothering to do a scientific investigation of the role that coyotes actually played in the world. So finally, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Murray brothers, Olaus and Adolf, working for two different government agencies, one of them working for the Biological Survey, began publishing monographs like The Ecology of the Coyote in Yellowstone. and the Ecology of the Coyote in Jackson Hole. That was Olaus Murray's contribution. What these studies demonstrated was that this animal that we were killing without ever having studied it, just assuming that it was the arch predator of America once wolves were taken care of, that actually more than 85% of what this animal did in the natural world was beneficial to human beings. It was not a threat to game species. I mean, some of these agency hunters had argued that if you let coyotes and wolves live in the United States, pretty soon that's all that's going to be left. They're going to wipe out everything. Never posing the question, as the biologist Aldo Leopold finally did in reviewing their books, well, if that's true, why didn't coyotes and wolves wipe out all the animals in North America before the Europeans ever got here? But that was sort of the way the debate was playing out in the 1940s and the 1950s. As I was growing up in Louisiana in the 1960s, these signs were everywhere as coyotes were expanding out of the West and moving across the country. They were beginning to do this. And that, of course, was the next step in the coyote story, the Coyote Biography. What's up with this? We're trying to wipe them out in the West, and instead they're doing this. And of course, what was actually happening was, having wiped out wolves in the East, we had created an open niche for a medium-sized predator. And because of all the pressure we were bringing to bear on coyotes in the interior West, we had launched them into migratory expansion. And they went, as you can see, in both directions. They were always in Southern California, but now they start moving. I mean, you can see they get all the way up into Alaska. And as I said, I was sort of right downstream of this when I was a kid. Here's in Caddo Parish is where I grew up. And these are scenes I began seeing when I was about 14 or 15 years old. And I described some of my experiences with coyotes, including the first times I ever saw them in Louisiana. So what begins to happen in the 1950s and 1960s is the whole gestalt of America begins to shift in all kinds of ways and for all kinds of reasons. But a variety of actors play central roles in forming a new impression about predators and coyotes in particular. One of them, of course, is Rachel Carson, with her great expose book, Silent Spring, about the poisoning of nature. Another is the Disney brothers, Walt and Roy. Persecuting coyotes, the way we had been doing it, was purely and simply an act of ideology, not based on science. Because from the 1920s on, scientists in the new field of ecology, who were conducting these first ever studies of coyotes and their role in nature, emerged as opponents of wiping out these predators. But nobody since Ernest Thompson Seton had written Tito was quite prepared for this unexpected outcome of coyotes spreading across America. As you saw from that map, millions of coyotes were now showing up in places they hadn't been before. And one of the things that contributed to that, I'll back it up just for a second so you can look at it again. One of the things that contributed to that, by the way, were new urban dog laws in the United States that rounded up stray dogs in every town of any size. And that opened up the niche for coyotes to begin moving into cities. Before dog laws and before dog catchers and dog pounds, coyotes weren't in American cities. As soon as dogs were rounded up and put in pounds and stray dogs disappeared from the streets of America, coyotes began showing up in town. How did coyotes manage to survive all of this and do what you see on this map? Well, Tito had been one answer, a kind of a allegorical one about coyote culture. Another answer came from folk traditions in the Southwest. In the Southwest, one of the sayings in the part of the world where I now live is, the only thing smarter than a coyote is God. But a pair of biologists, Guy Connolly and Fred Knowlton, finally came up with a solid scientific explanation for what was going on. As a result of coevolution alongside larger wolves, which had long harassed them, coyotes had evolved a remarkable set of survival traits. Under assault, they had larger litters. If coyote numbers went down, more food sources meant that they raised more pups into adulthood. If the breeding alpha female of a pack died, beta females, often several of them, bred and had pups. Most remarkably, coyotes had evolved a rare ability called fission fusion. It's an adaptation that emerging humanity also shared. Like us, in other words, coyotes are normally a social or fusion species. But when conditions warrant it, they can split into singles and pairs, fission, in other words, and scatter across the countryside and colonize. In the ancient human past, that trait, by the way, saved we humans from disease outbreaks again and again. Social distancing, in other words. For coyotes, Connolly and Knowlton's science showed that you could kill up to 70% of a regional population of coyotes year after year after year and never reduce their numbers. You could kill 7 out of 10 of them and their numbers would never go down. The only effect that kind of pressure really had on them was to spread their population across the country. So the conclusion for people living in the Coachella Valley and Los Angeles and Monterey is essentially that resistance is futile. Coyotes have always been here. They always will be. Naturalists found coyotes roaming the towns of the Central Coast in the 1830s. Los Angeles paid bounties on 650 coyotes in the year 1938. And at least 500 of them were living in the Hollywood Hills in the early 1960s. So our task is not just to learn how to live alongside them, it's to become good enough that having a small wolf in our midst allows us to become appreciators of the wild canid show we're getting to see. Understanding these animals as ancient neighbors, their yearly cycles, and when they're sensitive about dens and pups, and having a sense of scale is critical to that. As with all animals, we're coming to realize just how individualistic coyotes are. Urban studies of them indicate that 95% of them are model citizens as long as we don't feed them. And as long as we make an effort to keep them believing that we humans are just a little too weird to be trusted. But like people, some of them get into trouble. When that happens, a sense of scale helps. Every year, the newspapers report a scattered handful of coyotes biting people. Here's the scale of that. Between 1995 and 2010, an average of 3 people a year were bitten by coyotes in the entire country of Canada. During those same years, Canada averaged 3,000 dog bites a year. As with so many cultural trends, California has long pointed to America as a coyote world. Walt Disney Studio not only invented the nature documentary. From 1962 to 1974, Disney made 6 pro-coyote films that helped change the attitudes of many, including one known as The Coyote's Lament, an hour-long animation of American history told from the coyote point of view. Then from the mid to the late 20th century, Warner Brothers Studios gave America, well, some of these are out of, oh boy. I'll tell you what that is in just a second. Here we go. And from the 1950s to the late 20th century, Warner Brothers Studio gave America a sympathetic canid to identify with in the form of Wile E. Coyote, who in classic Coyote avatar fashion taught us all manner of things about obsession, humiliation, as well as instilling a certain wariness about being gullible consumers of corporate whiz-bang technology, if you will recall the Acme Corporation. And I'll show you, this is a Chicago artist did this poster of all the devices that Wile E. Coyote calls on that he buys from the Acme Corporation. As you know, none of them ends up working. And so in what is maybe the funniest New Yorker story ever written, a writer decides to take on Coyote bringing a product liability lawsuit against the Acme Corporation. And here is how it reads, as you can see. My client, Mr. Wile E. Coyote, a resident of Arizona and contiguous states, does hereby bring a suit for damages against the Acme Company, manufacturer and retail distributor of assorted merchandise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mr. Coyote seeks compensation for personal injuries, loss of business income, and mental suffering caused as a direct result of the actions and or gross negligence of said company relating to product liability. Mr. Coyote goes on, and then what he finally says is that it has ruined his occupation as a predator to rely on this company. So some of you who have read the book have seen this particular image in it. The people who created Wile E. Coyote had a studio for a while. In fact, I think they've just moved it. It's in a new location in Santa Fe. And I walked in one day to talk to them while I was working on the book about Wile E. Coyote. And I noticed behind the manager's desk this portrait on the wall. And as I was talking to him, I couldn't help it. My gaze kept going up to this portrait and looking at it. And I thought there's something uncannily familiar about this. I can't quite. And then as I looked at it, I began to realize, okay, so he's got a hat on. There's only one ear coming out of that hat, though. And I looked down at the title of the painting, and it was Wiley Van Gogh. So what I'll leave that one up as and I'll show you these. This is downtown LA, by the way. That's Portland on the city bus that takes you back and forth to the airport. Your seat mate could turn out to be an interesting companion, no doubt. This is in a sandwich shop in Chicago. And that is on the roof of a bar in Queens, New York. About 6 years ago, some people walked out of the bar, a little tipsy, heard a noise on the roof, turned and looked up. Here's a coyote standing on the roof of the bar above them. And someone in the bar, they went in and told people, somebody called animal damage control. And within 2 or 3 minutes, according to the story about this, animal damage control with the logo on the side of it rounds the corner. The coyote immediately recognizes the logo and turns and, like some sort of action hero, goes through a broken window into the building behind the bar and completely disappears. So what I wanted to say to you at the end is that California in the 60s sort of made Coyote into this kind of figure as this sort of cultural critic of America. And it's really Gary Snyder and his group of writers in San Francisco who found a journal called Coyotes Journal, and for years write stories about Coyote as this modern, sort of in the Indian Avatar guise, but he's the modern critic of modern America, of the militarization of America's foreign policy. I mean, the stories are, they've taken Coyote out of 10,000 years ago and brought him into the 20th century. And what I sort of suspect is that this kind of thing, as coyotes have spread around the United States, is going to become more and more familiar now. I'm noticing people are sending me cartoons and stories out of newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston and New York, where coyotes are beginning to play this same kind of role that they did on the West Coast back in the 1960s and 1970s in these Gary Snyder, Peter Coyote, Richard Brautigan kind of stories for Coyotes Journal. That, I think, finally, if it happens on the East Coast, is going to make the coyote into our national mammal at last. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Well, I don't have exactly a question, but I do have a follow-up on some of your observations, which I think were wonderful. I was at a research conference and there was a young student who was telling a story about he had been hired by cattle ranchers to determine why there wasn't enough forage in a particular area. And the cattle ranchers were convinced that it was because there were bison and cattle together, and the bison were eating forage that would otherwise be given to the cattle. And this researcher went in and studied it and found out that the bison and the cattle weren't eating the same thing. There was no competition there. And the cattle ranchers said, well, then why isn't there enough forage? And he said, well, it turns out that jackrabbits eat the same thing. And one of the cattle ranchers, after about 15 minutes, said, oh, I guess we should stop killing coyotes.
Yes, that's a great story. And that story is a very common one. I've got one like it in the book about, it was published in a California newspaper by a roving reporter who was in Utah, and he responded to the farmers in Utah very much the same way, who began in the 1880s claiming that maybe with all these rodents devouring our crops, it might be time to let the coyotes alone for a couple of years. Because, I mean, those kind of ecological connections were fairly evident to people who paid some small attention to what was going on in the world. The shocker to me has always been that the American scientific community, and the Biological Survey in particular, acting as an arm of the Stockmen's associations, was completely willing to launch these wars of extermination against coyotes and wolves, and succeeded quite well with wolves, of course, around which there is a story for why, as you might suspect, without ever doing any science. I mean, they just sort of brought over the old world perspective that if you have a herding culture, if you have stock of any kind, you want predators eliminated. And the Biological Survey scientists sort of translated that into, and that's also going to wipe out all your game animals, all your elk, all your bighorn sheep, all your pronghorns, mule deer, they're all going to disappear too, without ever stopping to think, as Aldo Leopold said, that, so how did it happen that these animals ever survived before Europeans got here? I mean, it was kind of a myopia that was frankly astonishing. But there we were. It led us to nearly a century's worth of efforts trying to wipe these animals out. Yes, please. Could I comment on which?
The Nixon slide.
The Nixon slide, sure. So the reason that particular slide was in there, and I'll back it up so we can all take a look at him, huh? No. All right, I'll leave that one up then. Richard Nixon, for purely cynical political reasons, I will add, is the American president who brings the poisoning war against coyotes to an end in 1972. And that's the reason his image is in there. I actually had, I think there was a slide that I quickly passed over that is the page in the book where I describe what he did. Richard Nixon, of course, some of you will know, Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. He signed into law the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which is still regarded as probably the crowning high point of the whole original Green New Deal of the 60s and 70s that gave us laws against pollution in the air and water and trails and river designations. And the endangered species of 1973 is largely responsible for the fact that we still have many of our animals in America. Richard Nixon did all this. He did all this for the very cynical reason that he saw environmentalism emerging from the first Earth Day in 1970 and from the so-called age of ecology as a political opportunity he wanted to surf. And so he thought he could convince Americans, especially young Americans who were opposing the war in Vietnam, that the Republicans and he in particular were environmentalists by supporting these laws. I mean, their position at the time was, when both Republicans and Democrats supported environmentalism, was, so how big an issue can this be after all? I mean, it's sort of like mom and apple pie, isn't it? So we'll get on the bandwagon and we'll support all these environmental initiatives. In Nixon's case in 1972, when he ended poisoning of coyotes on the American public lands, and eagles, by the way, as well, his position on that was basically, it's probably nothing but sentimentalism, but there's a whole bunch of voters out there who are going to think it's really neat and cool. Unfortunately, it didn't work for him. And so after he did sign the Endangered Species Act into law, he basically abandoned environmentalism. And I will say, he gives a speech, by the way, that I quote in Coyote America, and I also quoted it, the full speech, in this new book coming out in the fall, where he says, I mean, it's hard to put Richard Nixon's visage together with these words. This is the environmental awakening, he says in a speech to Congress. No one should deny that all other species have a right to exist, and it's not ours to take away from them. Now, that was right out of Aldo Leopold and what we call biocentrism. And I can guarantee you, Richard Nixon never read Aldo Leopold. And I doubt he knew how to pronounce biocentrism. But he had a speechwriter, Russell Train, who was an environmentalist, and wrote him this speech, and he delivered it to Congress in 1972. At a time when both Republicans and Democrats were all on board, as was seemingly everyone in America, with ecology and environmentalism, protecting species, protecting air, protecting water, cleaning up toxic waste sites. And in another 15 years, the Republican Party is referring to environmentalism as the replacement for Marxism as a threat to the American way. There's actually a political GOP platform paper from the election of 1984 that refers to the specter of environmentalism as a threat to America. But that happened in a period of about a dozen years. Push things back to 1967, 68, right up to 1973, and Republicans are right in there supporting environmentalism. And of course, one of our great questions in American life is how in the hell do we ever get back to that? How do we ever recover that kind of America? Yeah, please.
If more folks have questions, raise your hands and we'll bring the mics around. And while I'm walking back to you, sir, I had a question about, you sort of answered about how we can live better with coyotes. I mean, the obvious thing, not to kill them, but the other side is not to feed them. And maybe you could expand on that a little bit more, like why not feeding them is helpful.
Yes. Well, so if you guys don't know this, and I suspect many of you do, but if you don't know this, the best way to get coyotes killed is to start feeding them in your yards, because it not only begins to lure them, not just into your yard, but into the yards of other people looking for handouts, but it eliminates their fear of humans. And it also seems to inspire in them a certain annoyance when they show up and there's no food to be had. And that's when they tend to run through people's yards and snap at people sitting in lawn chairs and things. Now, as I mentioned in the course of the talk I did for you, coyotes are highly individualistic. And so, I mean, some of them are going to get into trouble. There are some of them that if they see a toddler, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old unattended on a porch or in a backyard, some of them, probably 1 in 100, might actually attack a child. But most of them, the studies that were done in Chicago among urban coyotes indicated that 95% of them never get any trouble in their entire lives living in cities. They never do anything like that. But just as is the case with us, there is a small percentage of coyotes that sometimes can get into trouble. But the quickest way to get the ordinary good citizen coyotes into trouble is to feed them in your yard. And if they start eating dog food, cat food, bird food, start getting fed scraps, I mean, they're almost surely going to get into trouble, because the next yard they show up in, somebody's going to say that must have rabies. Call somebody out and kill that thing because it's walking up within 20 feet of me and not running away. So by all means, do not feed wild animals. And as I said, do your best to keep them thinking that we're just too damn weird for them to trust. I mean, throw your best Nolan Ryan fastball rock at one if it gets too close.
Hey, thank you. Terrific talk. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I was always under the impression they were nocturnal coyote. Yet in the San Fernando Valley, where I also live, I see them often in the in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
One afternoon, 3 o'clock, I saw a pack of them, 5 of them, on someone's lawn in Sherman Oaks, and I didn't understand. Are they nocturnal?
Well, yes, they are nocturnal. I mean, most predators, actually, the prime times for hunting are at dusk and dawn. But what has happened with urban coyotes in particular, or animals that have spent a good time in cities, is that the lights are always on. And so one of the things that, and again, this is from the biologists who have studied them in cities, particularly I rely on the work of a guy named Stan Gerd at Ohio State, who's been studying the Chicago Coyotes for 25 years. When they come into cities, it's light all the time because lights are on everywhere. Mercury vapor lamps, billboards, street lights. And so it begins to disrupt the pattern that we all think of as being normal, where they're primarily out at night, early in the morning, in the evening dusk, and they start showing up all times of day at night. I mean, there probably are other factors that are contributing to that too, but from what I've read, that seems to be one of the primary factors, is that they're in settings where it's light all the time now. Yes, who else? Please.
Mine is not so much a question as to a comment. I've been a desert rat all my life, so I've lived down here. I've had several exchanges with coyotes. I used to work for a lady that would put out food for animals, and she lived next door to Elvis Presley's house up there. So we had, she had an open backyard. And the one thing I noticed there, because I'd have the windows shed, the animals would come through in a pattern. She was actually trying to feed stray cats. And she ended up feeding, this was just on the Chino Canyon Road. So just in northern Palm Springs here on this side. They'd have javelina come through from the desert, which is a wild boar, wild pig. I'd never in my entire life before then seen a javelina in Palm Springs. So that's a small pig, a furry little pig that's wild. Then you'd have every creature learn to have its time period to go through. And so coyotes would be a great steward of the great night. Middle about 2 o'clock in the morning, the coyotes would come through. After the raccoons, after the king skunks, after baby skunks, we'd have a little parade of animals, and you'd see them come through, and they're great adapters. I now, since have moved to Morongo Valley, and there I wish I had more coyotes, because I have gophers and small things that create holes all over. And the coyotes are so fabulous up there. So be everything you can do to support coyotes and wildlife and their range. We've taken mankind as a person, as a species, has taken all the wetlands, all the natural areas. Thank God we have places, preserves like the Morongo Valley Preserve, that has natural water that the animals can come to. Because we have still up there, I'm just a block away from that, you'll have the coyotes come through again. You have mule deer up there. It's a beautiful place. If you've not been to Morongo Valley, it's just up the hill. So in this hot summer, go see it and stay there in the twilight, and you'll hear the coyotes' beautiful song. You'll see great stars up there and see all the animals. So thank you for enriching us with your knowledge from the past, and also to keep the preserves and wildlife around. That's it. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Are there different breeds of coyotes, or do they all have the same basic DNA?
Well, they all have the same basic DNA, but one of the things that's happening in modern America, which is, one of our really kind of epic stories, is that the coyotes that have gone east have encountered remnant populations of wolves, and they have hybridized with those wolves to create an animal that in the Northeast they're now referring to as an eastern coyote or a coy wolf. It's about 85% coyote, but it has enough wolf genetics that the animals are packing up and actually hunting white-tailed deer. So what is happening in the East these days is that even though wolves were exterminated completely in the East by the 1940s, we've had, as a result of this coyote movement into the East and their arrival among some small populations of animals, particularly in Eastern Canada, hybridizing with them and then moving south into the Adirondacks and down farther south, in fact, into Pennsylvania and the middle states, that we are getting basically a wild canid reemerging in the East that's mostly coyote, but does have some wolf admixture. So in terms of most coyotes, they all belong to the same species. We classify them as Canis latrans, but there was quite a bit of subspecific taxonomy 30 or 40 years ago. There are books that were written in the 1950s, 1960s, even the 1970s that will show something like 20 different coyote subspecies. That was also true of wolves. And all of that so-called taxonomic splitting has in recent times been eliminated. And we're down now to sort of lumping the animals back together as a single species rather than a whole bunch of small regional types that were classified as subspecies. Yes. Well, in certain states.
Dan, can you repeat the question for the rest of the audience? Can you repeat the question?
Repeat it?
Yeah.
She wanted to know if there are wildlife departments that are still engaging in aerial gunning of coyotes. Some of you may have read that it's not just coyotes that are being gunned these days. And the agency, by the way, that became the predatory control arm of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. It's called Wildlife Services today. Still kills between 40 and 80,000 coyotes a year. And a significant number of them are gunned down from airplanes and helicopters. In New Mexico, where I live, about 5 years ago, there was a plane crash of 2 hunters from Wildlife Services attempting to shoot coyotes in eastern New Mexico, and they crashed their plane doing so. But I mean, we're now getting aerial hunting of wolves in states like Idaho and Montana. In those states, the state legislature has taken the program's state management of wolves away from the Fish and Wildlife departments in Idaho and Montana. And the legislature has basically taken over and passed laws making it legal to hunt wolves with airplanes, with helicopters, to snare them with wire snares. I mean, we have the old time 19th century war going once again in the last about 3 or 4 years. So the answer to your question is yes, unfortunately. Yeah. Sure. I mean, okay. So, you know, one of the ways that a lot of us interact with coyotes is that we're afraid for our dogs and our cats. Coyotes, we know, we see YouTube videos of a coyote jumping over a backyard fence and snatching a dog and taking off with it. I try to explain, once again, relying on the work of biologists who have been studying this phenomenon for quite a while. I try to explain in the book why this happens. And it doesn't happen for the reason that most of us think. It doesn't happen most of the time. There's one exception during the yearly round. But it doesn't, that kind of thing doesn't happen most of the time because coyotes are hungry and they're trying to catch a dog or a cat to eat it. The reason they're killing dogs and cats is because they regard dogs and cats as inter-guild competitors in their territories. They see a cat out hunting birds, and to a coyote, that's a competitor predator that has entered its territory that it then goes to some effort to try to kill or drive away. The one exception when this sometimes happens for food is in the time, and it's now through August, when coyotes are denning and have pups, because at that point, they're sort of scrambling to find all the protein they can in order to feed their pups. And so at that time of year, sometimes when a small dog or a cat gets killed, it will disappear which means that the coyote is taking it to its den to feed to its pups. Most of the year, though, whenever a dog or a cat gets killed by a coyote, you find the animal. It's left lying there. And in that instance, it's of course been killed because the coyote is regarded as an interguild predator. I've told people at talks I've done here over the last few years that for most of the year, if you find your cat and it's lying there on the street or lying in the yard and it's obviously been bitten and killed, but it's still there, that could be a coyote. But if it's disappeared, that more than likely is a great horned owl that has snatched your cat and taken it. There is a famous biologist story of a great horned owl roost in Wyoming under which 86 cat collars and tags were found. A yen for kitty cat, I think that would be called.
Question for you. I just got back down from living up in the high desert for the last 5 years, so I saw a lot more coyotes up there. And you mentioned that they're more individualistic, but do they sometimes work as a pack? Because the thought up there is that there will be a kind of a scout that maybe goes out and sees what's available and then grabs it. So a scout sort of
There you go.
concept.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then last year we had a virus amongst the jackrabbits, and that was also giving the mange or some sort of disease then on to the coyotes. So I'm not sure how that's worked out.
Well, I didn't catch quite all of that. The first about half of it I didn't quite hear, but I don't know, were you were telling a story or were you asking me something? So giving the mic again. Yeah.
Or is it? Yep. Okay. Yeah. Up in the high desert. I was only up there about 5 years, but people, the sort of stories that get told is that they hunt, they're in a pack, but they'll send a scout out to see what's available and maybe then round her out and be able to take the prey down. I don't know if they send scouts out, but that's the thought up there. So, and then the other thing was just the issue of rabbits, jackrabbits, and the virus affecting the coyotes.
Well, I've never seen that. So did you hear what he said? Coyotes would send, and hunting rabbits would send a scout out to see what was. Yeah, I've never seen anything like that happen myself. But the guys who ran and still run the Predator Research Facility in Utah, when I went to interview them, one of the things they said was, nothing a coyote ever does surprises us. So I think that story falls into that category. Wouldn't surprise me at all that would happen. One more question.
I had heard that coyotes, maybe I guess when they're in, I guess it would be the season when they might hunt dogs or cats, especially dogs, that possibly they act like there's a female in heat, or maybe there is a female in heat, to draw out the dog, a domestic dog, to kill it. Is that something you'd heard before or seen? Or?
Well, that's certainly a widespread story. I've heard that one, yeah, a lot. That coyote showed up in the yard, led my dog away, and then 4 other coyotes hiding out in the shrubbery attacked it. I think it falls into the category of more urban legend than anything else. I think what actually tends to happen, and I've certainly watched it happen with my dog and with quite a number of other dogs, they see a coyote, they take off after it. And the coyote takes off running. And the way, I mean, in that Mark Twain description I had up on about the 3rd page of that, he ends that by describing, and a coyote will get out in front of a dog and will just barely lope along, just staying about 5 or 6 feet out in front. And the dog is really inspired and he's really going, and the coyote is, And then suddenly, like a lightning strike, there's a crack to the horizon and the coyote is gone. I think that's what usually happens. A dog takes off after a coyote. They will sort of trundle along in front and sort of play with a dog for a while. And then usually they will take off. Now, I have no doubt that there have been occasions when a single coyote out of a pack took off doing that, and the rest of the pack was down the hill or in the canyon below. And if the dog got down there, it got into trouble. But I don't think that's a strategy that coyotes have. I don't think they deliberately do that, but it is a very widespread story. Yeah. I've hardly ever talked about coyotes anywhere that somebody had said, I think they led my dog out.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for this evening. It was
Thank you.
well worth the wait. Thank you.